Hello, everybody. Welcome back for our last lecture of the semester. This one will be a lot shorter than the other ones. I am going to give you some um, short little things to think about while you close up for, your final essay, and also for the final discussion question. So I'll give you any sort of like additional stuff about the essay as you give me feedback for it. If it's something that you need like an FAQ page for or something like that, I'll be happy to do that. But we're just going to talk about this final topic here, which is bringing everything back together and coming back to these broad terms that we introduced the class with, which is the age of revolutions in the Atlantic world, and whether we see these things to still be true and how we conceptualize of these things now that we've come to the end of the class. So the final chapter in Klooster does a pretty good job at actually consolidating everything that you've covered throughout the book, really bringing us back to some common themes that he introduces in the introductory chapter. So it's a good way to remind yourself as you're writing this final essay of everything that's going on in all of these different revolutions, because I know, like any ASU online class, it's a lot of information being thrown at you in a short period of time. So a few things that you want to keep in mind, right, when we're thinking about common themes that exist within the revolutions. The reason behind why Klooster felt like this book could be written, right, is you've got these ideological components that are tied to this concept of ending privilege and fighting back against these large empires that had been in existence for quite some time, and seeking some sort of fundamental change in our system of governance, right? To the degree that these play out in a way that results in, say, a democratic society, right? Klooster is going to argue that they don't, right, fundamentally, regardless of the revolution that we're looking at. And it wasn't even necessarily the end goal of most of these revolutionary figures and movements, right? In terms of conversations that are being had by people who are discussing Enlightenment principles, the goal behind a lot of these movements, especially when we're looking at the colonies, is going to be sovereignty, right? Having a level of independence from the mother country that they were not able to attain prior to this point. Idea of a democratic society, whether we're looking at this particular quote from D'Alembert, or we look at somebody like John Adams, right, or look at some of the other figures that, say, like Miranda in Latin America. There isn't any sort of movement towards a total democratic society, because in many cases, leaders of revolutionary movements and people who were writing governing documents didn't really trust the mob or the masses, right? Did not feel like they were capable of being able to participate in society in the way in which it was necessary to do as part of a new sort of system founded on principles of the Enlightenment. And so this is why we know within the United States, right, it takes quite some time for our Constitution and even state and local governance to become more democratic. We don't have major movements towards this till we could look at something like the Age of Jackson, right, expansion of democracy to most of the white male voting public. But really, in terms of massive changes, not even until the 20th century, you look at progressive era movements, right, and women's suffrage, direct election of senators at the state and local level. Look at a state like Arizona, which is founded on progressive era principles, introduction of things like referendum and recall. All of these things that expand our democracy are not really present until much later after the Age of Revolutions, right? So, in terms of just like we saw last week, in many cases, what we see taking place in terms of rule after the revolution is over in many of these polities is tied to creating a system of governance that is going to be able to function, to take on all of the concerns, whether those are economic or political, that arise in the absence of a previous rule of law, right? So, in a lot of cases, these systems of rule are authoritarian, as we have seen throughout the course of the semester. Other themes that Klooster talks about, right, are ones that are tied to why we are looking at this from an Atlantic world sort of perspective, right? We have to take into account all of the international contexts that play a role in how the revolutions develop, how they influence one another, how they continue to influence one another in this larger economic and social system that exists between all of these different regions and countries. And of course, the other components that Klooster is interested in addressing, which we're going to come back here to and talk about in a second, is this concept of the common people, because it is always in pretty much every topic of interest in history is really difficult to get to the root of, right? What did these people at this particular time believe? Why did they take the actions that they took? And Klooster, I think, to a degree, goes into this in his own text, but is much more invested in the end result, which is part of his argument in that revolutions would not have been successful if they had not been able to inspire a wide swath of people to engage in the revolutionary effort, right? You had to have people on the ground fighting for this liberation, and that is not just the upper classes who are debating these issues of the Enlightenment, right? So the last theme that Klooster mentions, that he will expand on there in his conclusion, right, is all of the ways in which we can also look at the flip side, right? Not necessarily all of the concerns that are coming from colonists or coming from citizens or people within the larger structure who are discontented with how this governance is run, but the governors themselves, right? The monarchy, other representative figures within the government who exacerbate the situation and ensure that this is not just a minor dispute, but leads down the path of revolution and later independence. So this is something that you want to keep in mind. Read critically if you're convinced by all of these themes or if you're not. We're going to focus more on the broad sort of terms that we've come up with to help define what this course is about from week one, essentially. And we're coming back to them and asking ourselves whether we think these are good terms to use and ways of thinking about these particular events in human history. So we have two terms that we're going to look at, the Age of Revolutions and the Atlantic World. So come back to this idea of the Age of Revolutions. If we look at all of the various revolutions and uprisings that come into being during this time period or in the decades following the Latin American revolutions, we can ask ourselves whether we feel like it's fair to limit the Age of Revolutions to the revolutions that we've covered. Of course, for our purposes, in a 7.5 week class, there's not much else we could do to go beyond what we have fit into these weeks. But if we were, thinking about a larger sort of world of scholarship and conversations to be had about the Age of Revolutions, could we expand this outwards all the way up to, say, the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century? All of the things that are happening in Europe as a result of, say, the Napoleonic Wars, of the French Revolution. We don't really talk about any of these things at all in this class, but it is worth considering, should we incorporate these into these conversations that we're having about all of these themes, all of these developments and contexts. In terms of the themes that we have covered up to this point, right, things that we can kind of fit under the umbrella of the Age of Revolutions. We've got all of these ideological concerns like liberty and the Enlightenment. We've got similarities in terms of the types of economies and labor systems that exist throughout these regions. Slavery being a major component of what is present and being discussed in all of these revolutionary efforts, whether they are dealt with sufficiently or not, and in many cases not, but it also does signal the end of slavery as an institution in many ways. We have also got the question of race, right? All of the unique conditions of colonization and the intermixing of different races that exist within these new continents. And then, of course, the development of empire, right, also helps solidify for us understandings of the Age of Revolutions, and how these empires developed, how they interacted with one another, the sort of political structures they created, critiques that people had of these political structures that led to this watershed moment in time in which all of these revolutions are occurring. The non-Klooster reading that you're going to have this week is going to really hone in on this question of the Age of Revolutions and whether we are going far enough in terms of our analysis, and how we can continue to think about expanding this idea further. Other themes that we can consider, other angles or lenses to which we can think about the Age of Revolutions. And it's important because we're always seeking to build scholarship outward, right? And ensure that we have a fuller understanding, a clearer picture of the past to the degree that we're capable of doing it. Trullo, who is mentioned in this reading, is like a seminal work in the world of revolutions, but also in history, generally speaking, especially in understanding how history is constructed. He wrote a book titled Silencing the Past. It's a really good book if you're just, interested in the Haitian Revolution, but also just interested in like how source material is compiled and constructed and presented to public audiences. But essentially what Trullo is talking about in the process of using the Haitian Revolution as his example is all of the ways in which the past is silenced, and the degree to which we can recover that silenced past, right? And so this is the key question going back to this critique that I have of Klooster, right? Which is you don't hear that much about the common people in these revolutions. You don't have a great understanding of what we could refer to as like the ordinary, right, voices of the time period. And this other article is asking us, to the degree that we can use scholarship to try to uncover some of these understandings, which is not just about like hearing more from these people, but also can give us a sense of providing a new angle of why people were engaged in these revolutionary movements, right? Which may not only be limited to some of the narratives that we have discussed to this point in the semester, because we have not uncovered enough about the common people to be able to determine these things. And so this is what Trullo like challenges us to think about, which is we, by our nature of focusing on certain figures or certain movements, certain aspects of the Age of Revolutions, we do, on the flip side, by including certain things or always leaving other things out, which leads on a broader scale to a process of forgetting key components of the past. And we can't ever include anything. History at its basic level is a narrative. It has to tell a story, right? If we included every single possible thing that we could, it wouldn't be comprehensible, right? And so how do we create a better understanding of the Age of Revolutions if we're looking at it under this framework? This article is asking us to think about that. Another arena that we don't necessarily cover in this class, it is mentioned briefly, I think, in some of the sources that we've covered throughout the point in the semester, but we could think more about as well, right, is the element of counter-revolution and its role in the Age of Revolutions, how it impacts developments of the revolutions themselves, right? You have people who are either loyalist, right, or they are essentially pushing back against the principles of the Enlightenment, or a representative government, or the concept of how liberation should occur. We do look at some of the tension behind this when we look at like somebody like Edmund Burke, but fundamentally Burke is still engaging with the ideas of the Enlightenment. We know there are people on the ground living in these areas who are clearly counter-revolutionaries that we could focus on in more depth, right, when we're thinking about the Age of Revolutions, because sometimes we're going through this narrative and we're thinking about mass mobilization, then we start to kind of put ourselves into the mindset of, oh, most people were revolutionaries, or almost all people were revolutionaries, and we know that that's not true, right? Even if we look at, say, in the United States, the founding fathers, right, in their origins, many of them were clearly loyalists, had loyalists in their own families, right? In the case of somebody like Benjamin Franklin, basically has a huge falling out with his son because his son remains a loyalist throughout the revolution as well. So it's something to consider in terms of its impacts that we don't have time to cover in this short course. Our other term that we are thinking about here at the end is this concept of the Atlantic world, which I also asked you about way back in our first like real discussion board question, right? So when we're thinking about the Atlantic world and the way in which we've defined it as a method of scholarly analysis, right? Do we think there are here at the end enough commonalities for that to be true? It's a very large region. It's very diverse. It includes multiple continents, right? It is, in some cases, you look at, some of the individual revolutions that we've covered up to this point, say the Spanish revolutions in particular, there is a decent amount of work by scholars to say that there is some key fundamental differences that become downplayed when we talk about them in the context of an Atlantic world and Atlantic world revolutions. There's also the critique by scholars that in the nature of defining the Atlantic world, which generally runs from the point of, you know, the the age of contact, right? Age of exploration. And depending on who you're talking to, through the age of revolutions or the end of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, is this a good category to put all of these different peoples and empires into? But also, are we by its nature, because of the time frame in which we're putting this entire period into in this category, overly tied to imperialism and the concept of the empire, right? Because we don't refer to it as the Atlantic world until we have the period of contact, the invasion of empires into the New World, the implementation of these international trade systems, right? The Columbian Exchange, and then we end them almost, in a lot of scholarship, we end them at the moment at which the empires end. So is it too empire centric? And this goes, to these other questions that I've listed here on the PowerPoint slide. Is this a good way of categorizing this entire region anyway, right? To kind of start it at the point of contact, to end it at the point in which the revolutions end. Think of, the fact that at the end of the revolutions, as I believe Klooster mentions, if it wasn't another source that I put in there earlier this semester, also signals the end of the transatlantic slave trade, right? Like in the United States, ending in 1808, I believe. Other regions throughout the, Latin America also ending at the similar time frame, signaling the end of these major institutions that had tied the Atlantic world together. All of these things start to go away, but we're also ignoring other components of, the types of climate or terrain, or the types of food or clothing or any number of things that are produced in an Atlantic world context that maybe still exist for us to the present, trade agreements, negotiations, all of the ways in which all of this history continues to impact the area would have been known as the Atlantic world, continues to impact us today, which is the Americas, right? The western coast of Africa, parts of Europe, right? All of these areas continue to be impacted by these things. So should we say there is this clear point at which we have an end? Can we solidify the end of the Atlantic world with the revolutions? There are no easy, clear answers to these questions, and so we're leaving it open-ended for ourselves here as we bring it all together, and these are tied to the questions that I'm asking you here in this final discussion board, which is to have a little bit of fun with it, right? Think about how we could expand this outward. Is there another revolution that you're really interested in that you think we could analyze in the same framework, should be included in this age of revolutions, that we haven't talked about? And whether we think we can truly understand this in the way that we've constructed it this entire class. Did it work for you? And it's okay to say that it doesn't, or that it minimizes certain things, or that you really think it works in terms of being able to present a new understanding of some of these events that we tend to, at least for a few of them, already know quite a bit about. So on that note, I'm going to leave us off here. If you have any final questions about doing the last assignment, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great sort of last week or so of your semester, and I looked, had a good time having all of you in this class.